Chapter 3. It didn't appear to be raining, but the tiny ripples that vibrated and distorted the streetlight's reflections and the puddles scattered across the road suggested otherwise. The protagonist had hoped that his short sojourn in the factory would have warmed him, but somehow, as he walked the desolate streets again, he felt even colder than he did before. Maybe the wind was rising. He pushed the brim of his hat lower against his forehead and pressed on. He soon came to a cinder-block building that abutted the sidewalk. The face of the building was painted off-white and bore the cracks and stains of age. Towering above was a neon sign, slowly rotating on its pole. In earlier times, it had read, Threnody Liquors, but all the bulbs were burned out, save for the N, O, and D. The street in front of the store was lit by bright overhead lights in a futile attempt to ward off any ne'er-do-wells intent on lurking in dark shadows at this late hour. As he approached, he spotted several hooded figures loitering by the entrance and around a corner that extended down an unlit, seemingly endless alley behind the store. The ominous figures leaned impiously against the wall in twos and threes, talking in low voices and sharing cigarettes or swigs from bottles. The protagonist's body tensed with, if not fear exactly, perhaps anticipation and dread. He was alone and unguarded. His first thought was that they must be fugitives or vagabonds, ready to pounce upon a lone traveler as he passed. However, as he grew closer, he saw that it was untrue. They were nothing more than boys. They slouched in rough denim jackets and hoodies pulled tightly around their temples, arms crossed against their chests to protect themselves from the chill rain. Their words were deep and guttural and almost foreign to his ears, making references and expressing idioms he could never hope to understand at his advanced age. As miserable as the weather was, it was apparent that the teens were content to be here together on this dark and rain-swept street. Occasional chuckles arose. Two kids playfully slapped each other on the back in solidarity over some unheard quip. One boy came out of the store with several sodas and candy bars to share. The protagonist wondered what life circumstances existed for these young souls that made leaning against a cement wall in the middle of a rainy night preferable to being ensconced in a warm bed. But he had no answer to that, and so quickly put the question out of his mind. As he passed, one young boy, who couldn't have been more than 13, said to him, "Hey, got a smoke?" without looking up. His companion shot him a worried glance and slapped him on the arm. The boy's eyes then locked on the protagonist's. A panicked expression crossed the boy's face. "Oh, sorry, mister," he said sheepishly. The protagonist walked on. "Dumbass," he heard the boy's companion whisper in admonition. Looming above the store was an overpass that allowed the cars going north and south above from having to stop for all the cars going east and west below. A tall fence had been erected on the overpass. It curved inward slightly to deter climbers. Someone had once hung a sign made of a bedsheet from the fence, but it had long since been blown to unreadable tatters. A few more boys stood on the overpass, keeping stoic watch over their brethren below. A car passed the protagonist, splashing muddy water onto the sidewalk in front of him. As it sped by, the boys on the overpass drew eggs from their pockets and threw them down onto the car, resulting in several loud, wet thumps as they landed on its roof. The car flashed its brake lights for a second, but then continued driving. As the boys fled down the street and into the darkness, they gleefully cheered as if they had slain a dragon with their assault. The protagonist continued eastward. Even from several blocks away, he could tell that the street he was walking on would soon end, as ahead of him lay a zone of infinite blackness. It was the gateway to a park, the largest in the city. As he trudged on, the buildings fell away behind him, and he was soon surrounded by trees in a darkness that was only dimly held at bay by an occasional lamp that beamed a feeble, yellowish light from above the walking path. Even the noise of the city seemed to recede into quiet. The branches of the canopy were leafless and vibrated audibly, though invisibly, as the wind gusted through them. He reached an opening that led to the shore of a large pond. It was easy to imagine that, in warmer and brighter times, children would play here. A dock held a dozen paddle boats constructed in the shape of swans. The way they had been tied up for the winter made it seem as if they were desperately huddled together against the cold. Their dead, plastic eyes stared at the protagonist as he passed. It was as good a place as any for a rest. He sat down on the park bench that had been oriented to provide the best view of the lake, the boaters, and a small playground consisting of little more than a set of limply hanging swings. He appeared to be alone. Past the lake and the trees towered some of the tallest buildings in the city, buildings which had undoubtedly been constructed to provide their residents a magnificent view of the park below. The protagonist imagined the view from that height. At this hour, the park must have seemed an impenetrable blank darkness, hollowed out from the otherwise illuminated city blocks. Absent-mindedly, he found himself counting windows. He lost count after at least 50. There must be several hundred different apartments in that one building alone, he thought to himself. Several hundred people whom he would never meet. Just in that one single tower were several hundred homes, filled with couches and beds and cake servers and memories and the smells of exotic meals, the sounds of arguments and wails of tragedies, and drawings hanging on the fridge that had been brought home from school by a child, and faded photographs of relatives long deceased. And he would never be an observer to any of it. He would never know those people. Then he multiplied that thought by all the buildings he could see rising up around him. At least 20 more stood side by side right on that one block alone. Then multiplied again by all the other blocks in the city, and multiplied again by all the cities in the world. His imagination built a Venn diagram of experience. A small circle in the middle represented the furthest extent of his world. A few other circles intersected with him. Some, like the woman from earlier tonight, only briefly touched him in one shared moment. Others overlapped more significantly. But outside of his circle were millions, billions of other circles, existing in all directions, that never touched his circle at all. Those experiences were forever unknowable to him. He felt small and insignificant and very lonely. The sky cleared of clouds, and the park brightened slightly in the moonlight. The protagonist's eyes drifted upward. Like they are in most cities, the heavens above were a dull gunmetal gray, not black. But a few of the brightest and most persistent stars were visible. Beyond them lay millions of other stars, hidden from view, but there nonetheless. Further beyond were millions of galaxies, each filled with millions of stars of their own, each star surrounded by planets, each planet dotted with cities, each cities filled with towering buildings, filled with hundreds of apartments, filled with beings the protagonist would never know. Since he did not know them, or share their experiences, those people couldn't exist as discrete entities in the protagonist's reality. They were just each a vague, smeared-out superposition of all the probabilities that a person might potentially be. The protagonist then came to the unpalatable conclusion that if that were the case, then logically, conversely, he must not exist in their realities either. Every observer experiences the world from a unique perspective, and so creates their own unique universe through their observation. Billions and billions of overlapping universes created by billions and billions of people out there, living full and complete lives, each in a unique universe that partially, but not completely, overlaps all the others. And in almost all of those universes, the protagonist simply didn't exist. The only places he could truly say he existed were in the minds of those vanishingly few souls who remembered him, as well as in his own jumbled memories. The overwhelming feeling of isolation was too much to bear, and he put his head in his hands and wept silently. After a time, he became distracted by a small beetle crawling past his foot. He followed the tiny thing as it went about its business. The bug stopped by his feet for a second, but only a second, and looked at him uncomprehendingly. "Nice night for a stroll, don't you think?" it said to him perfunctorily, just before it crawled under a nearby trash can. The protagonist noticed several other beetles also wandering to and fro, a whole society of them scurrying around almost unnoticed in the dim light. "How about if I sleep a bit longer and forget all this nonsense?" one insect bemoaned to its neighbor as they passed. A moth skittered through the air drunkenly. A worm thrashed about, fighting for its life in a tiny puddle. Undoubtedly, the underbrush in the park contained generations of rats and squirrels and moles nursing their young in makeshift burrows, an entire safari of creatures playing out their stories in this one square acre, oblivious to the wider world around them. A droplet of rainwater landed on the protagonist's hand. He lifted it to his face and stared at it intently. Inside the droplet, barely visible, was a swirl of dust particles that had accumulated in its fall from the heavens. Beyond that dust lay countless single-celled organisms, happily living and eating and reproducing and dying inside the droplet, oblivious to the beetles and the worms and everything else that existed in the park. The protagonist strained to add all these tiny circles to his Venn diagram, but it quickly became too impossibly large to hold it all in his head, an infinity of infinities. So, he just sat back up and let his mind go blank. The protagonist had almost fallen asleep when a man walked by. "Nice night for a stroll, isn't it?" he said perfunctorily as he passed. Before the protagonist could formulate a response, the man had continued onward out of earshot, circumnavigating a path around the lake. The chains of the playground swings began creaking as a light breeze arose. He imagined children swinging back and forth. Had he ever been on a swing? He couldn't remember any specific instance of ever being on one, but it must have happened at some point. He considered getting up and sitting on the swing now, but then he remembered the candy in his pocket. He opened the wrapper that depicted the cartoonish face of a small child bearing an impossibly huge grin. Inside was a jelly-like blob. It was blue and dusted in white powder. In a trick of the dim light, the candy appeared to almost glow in the dark. The protagonist sniffed the treat cautiously. It had no smell. He pressed it gently against his tongue and experienced the unremarkable taste of sugar. It didn't seem poisonous. He put the entire candy in his mouth and began to chew. He watched as the children ran back and forth, while they called out to each other with laughter and grinning faces and expressions of wonder and joy. They moved their small bodies in an entirely contradictory manner. Under the cover of a child's game, they circled about the playground like predators, looking for a moment of weakness to strike. They feinted and pushed at one another, trading tags and touches and slaps and trips. They fought for dominance. It was tribal, primal, feral. Groups forming and reforming around the strongest competitors, the smallest and weakly, slowly but inexorably becoming outcast, taunted and ridden down by fiercer rivals. "Poindexter! Four Eyes! Dork!" they shouted and hurled stones at anyone who did not possess the temerity to return fire. Innocent grins took on the appearance of the baring and gnashing of teeth. Soon, a child was down on the ground, skin, knee, face in the dirt. The other children, still bursting with laughter and with grinning faces and eyes wide with wonder, pounced like lions upon the unfortunate one in a hail of fists and fury. It was over almost as soon as it began. Dominance determined through tears and screams of anguish and cries for mercy. The tribal order was settled. The victorious children had once again played together harmoniously as they schemed internally over the choice for their next target. The losers cowered at the fringes, licking their wounds. The protagonist's mouth was filled with the taste of mud and blood. He spit the candy onto the ground in disgust. It bounced off the shoe of a person sitting on the bench next to him. The protagonist spit once more to fully clear the unpleasant taste from his mouth. "You don't look so good," the person said. It was a man in his middle age. His eyes were partially hidden behind small teacup glasses. His head was crowned with a mop of wiry blonde hair that appeared faded and washed out. He was unshaven and unkempt, and was clad in what appeared to be a stained white lab coat. On his lap was a sheaf of papers at least 2 inches thick. "I'm sorry, I didn't see you sit down," said the protagonist. The strange man was uncomfortably close and smiling broadly. "Are you someone important to me?" he asked the man. The strange man did not respond to the question, but instead said, "Do you want to see what I have here?" He tapped the sheaf of papers. "I hate to bother you at this late hour, but I've just completed my life's work." He sighed. "And, well, I just really wanted to tell someone, I'm very proud of it. But there aren't many people in the park at this hour. Please say you'll look at it." "I suppose you can show it to me," replied the protagonist. "But don't you have someone close to you that'd be more interested than some random, unfamiliar person sitting alone on a park bench?" The strange man became downcast. "I guess I've been too focused these last few years on the work. I think that I used to have friends, but if I did, I can't remember their names anymore. I had a brother once, but I'm pretty sure he died in the war. My colleagues have all rejected me as a kook. I don't have anyone." He paused for a second and attempted to sound more upbeat. "But it's worth it. My work, it's going to save us all." "It would be nice to be saved. Go ahead and explain," he said sympathetically. The protagonist thought to himself that listening to a strange man's story would at least take his mind off the vision of feral children. The strange man grinned hopefully, and he started turning the pages of his manuscript. "Did you know how scientists go about proving things these days? They do it mathematically. It's true, you can prove everything with just abstract numbers. Some scientist simply writes equations on a piece of paper that say some phenomena like black holes or electrons or elementary forces or quantum fields and all that other bric-a-brac the universe contains can exist. And if something can exist, then the equations hold that it must exist. And if it must exist, then it does. It does exist. Everything in the universe exists because the math says it has to exist. You can't argue with math. 2 plus 2 is 4. That's just a fact." The protagonist looked down at the papers the strange man was pointing to. They were filled with scribbled equations containing not only recognizable numbers and letters, but also esoteric and unidentifiable symbols. "I've never tried to argue with math," he said, "but I'll take your word for it." "So, here's the breakthrough," the strange man continued. "I've spent my life studying the universe and physics and math and equations and putting them all together in a million different ways to try to get to some fundamental truth about the nature of existence. At first, I couldn't connect it all into a single theory that would explain everything, so I kept studying and studying, field after field after field, doctorate after doctorate after doctorate. The easy part, of course, was first devising a finite set of axioms that produced all possible true mathematical statements. But even after that, it took another decade of poring over equations for it to start to become clear. But here, if you look here on page 86, he pointed to a line of symbols on that page. You see right here? You see what this means?" "I see where you're pointing, but I don't understand what that means." "It's as clear as day," he said animatedly. "This specific line proves that God can exist. And if God can exist, then God must exist. And if God must exist, then God does exist. It's right here in the physics. We don't have to take it on faith anymore. We have proof now. Hard, undeniable, incontrovertible proof. It's right here." "Okay," the protagonist said skeptically. "How can you not believe me?" "I want to believe you. I just don't know what most of these symbols mean." He pointed at one. "What's this? It looks like a cartoon of an upside-down duck. And that one over there looks like a ham sandwich." "Well, of course, I had to invent some new symbols for a few variables that had never been described before, but they're all defined in the extensive appendix." The strange man flipped back and forth through his papers. "You can see here that this equation uses the curvilinear quantum field equation that I modified in the previous section, but then applies an inverse Lorentz transformation to 6D eigenspace." He went on like that for several minutes, going back and forth through the manuscript, rambling in what was almost a foreign language. The protagonist didn't understand a word of it. The strange man became disheartened. Can't you see? I wish I could see. It would be a comforting thing to be sure of, certainly. But I'm afraid I'm not smart enough to understand the math. Unlike you, I haven't spent decades learning the fundamentals like you have. The way you describe how much work you've put in, I'm not sure anyone but you is going to understand the math. But if it makes you feel better, I'm willing to take it on faith that this is correct. But you're missing the point, the strange man yelled. The point is that this is proof. It's supposed to make it so you don't have to take it on faith. It's so clear to me. God, the machine elves, what happens to you after you cross the event horizon of a black hole, why there's evil in the world, what we're supposed to be doing here with our time on Earth. It's all right here in the equations, but I can't make you see. I've dedicated my life to this. He trailed off. The protagonist felt sorry for the strange man. If no one can understand, then it's just nonsense, isn't it? What's written on these pages. It's not transmittable, just semic. Just because I don't understand it doesn't mean it's nonsense. Maybe you could find some disciples and teach them what all this means, and they can go out and try to explain it to dummies like me. He trailed off, and it became clear that the strange man had stopped listening. The man stood up, spilling his treasured papers on the ground, and walked away, not saying another word. The protagonist watched as the strange man followed the path, circumnavigating the lake. He picked up the precious papers and brushed the dirt and water off them. Maybe the man would come back for them, he thought. He had intended on leaving them on the bench, weighted down with a rock, but he found himself flipping through the pages. It was as comprehensive as it was incomprehensible. After paging through the work for a bit, the protagonist stopped to ask one of the beetles scurrying past his feet if it understood what this guy was talking about. The beetle just shrugged and went on its way. It was too busy living its life to have time to worry about its place in the larger universe. The final page ended with the words, "This final equation holds that I will try to explain this work to a man sitting on a bench in the park at night, but he will not understand a word. After that, all hope is lost." Next to that last sentence was an arrow pointing to a detailed drawing of a bedraggled man in a raincoat who was eerily similar to the protagonist. He looked up and saw the small figure of the strange man all the way on the other side of the lake. The man was climbing up a tree with a rope in his hand. The protagonist watched as the strange man tied the rope to a limb. "Wait! Stop!" shouted the protagonist, but the man was too far away to hear him. It would take too long to run around the entirety of the lake to arrive in time, so the protagonist just stood impotently and watched as the strange man tied the other end of the rope around his neck and fell out of the tree, ending with a jerk and a wrench. The body slowly swayed in the light breeze. Soon after that, several Erelem, clad only in their eerie blue glow, appeared from the underbrush. The little things climbed over the man as he hung from the limb and began to go through the pockets of his lab coat. The protagonist again heard the creaking of the playground swing swaying, but this time he looked further afield and realized he had been mistaken. What he had thought was the sound of swings swaying in the breeze was, in fact, the sound of other suicides swaying on the end of their ropes like strange fruit. The city, of course, had people on staff to take care of such things, but they only worked during the day, so by this time of night, the number of uncollected was starting to pile up. It gave the park an unpleasant character, and the protagonist decided he didn't want to be there anymore. He pondered what to do with the document he still held in his hand. He considered just dropping it in a trash bin, but that seemed a bit disrespectful. He considered leaving it on the bench, in case someone curiouser and smarter than him wandered by, but the bench was already a bit damp, and it was likely to rain again before morning, so leaving it was functionally the same as throwing it away. In the end, he rolled it up and stuffed it into one of the large pockets of his overcoat. The protagonist hurriedly left the park by the least disturbing route possible, and soon found himself back on the streets of the great city.